Seat. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Our Lady, seat of wisdom. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Good evening, everyone. I'm Father Anthony Brausch, the president and rector of Mount St. Mary's Seminary and School of Theology, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening for our LeBlond lecture. Before I have Father David Enders come forward, our dean, to introduce this evening's speaker, I would just say that there are some materials on the table back there for those who are our guests and are not familiar with what we do here or some of the programs that are offered, and of course to welcome those who are joining us via live stream this evening, and again offer you the opportunity to look at our website and the course offerings and other programming we have here. So again, welcome to all. I think it's going to be an interesting and worthwhile time to hear what Professor has to say. And now I'd like to have Father David Enders come forward to introduce this evening's speaker.
Certainly a great joy to be able to welcome Dr. Deneen this evening. Dr. Deneen is professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. Prior to joining the faculty there, he taught at Princeton University and also Georgetown University, and served as speechwriter and special assistant to the director of the U.S. Information Agency. He is the author of several books, including Why Liberalism Failed, which was published in 2018. It's been widely discussed and debated and translated into 15 languages. Dr. Deneen received a bachelor's in English literature from Rutgers in 1986 and the doctorate in political science also from Rutgers in 1995. His dissertation was awarded the American Political Science Association's Leo Strauss Award for the best dissertation in political theory. His interests range from ancient to modern political thought, democratic theory, American political thought, political theology, religion, and American liberalism, and literature and politics. So we're in for a real treat tonight. We welcome Dr. Deneen.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I should have warned you that I know a little bit about a lot of things and nothing about one thing, or not much about one thing. So I don't know what kind of treat you'll be in for, but I need to turn this on. They should have showed me how to do this. Great, okay. Is that working? There it is, okay. Thank you, and thanks to Ken Craycraft for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be able to spend some time with Ken, who I've known more through our common intellectual interests than known in person. I think we've seen each other briefly from time to time, but it's really delightful to share some time with you as well. I was very blessed and fortunate to be able to attend Mass tonight in the St. Gregory Chapel, I'm told, although it's really a big chapel. And I was struck, as I often am when I attend Mass and I'm giving a talk or even just a lecture on my campus, I'm often struck by the amazing coincidental appropriateness of one of the readings to whatever it is that I happen to be talking about later that day. Today's psalm was Psalm 49. It begins in this way. This is the King James Version. Hear this, all ye people. Give ear, all ye inhabitants of the world. Both low and high, rich and poor, together. The psalmist begins. My mouth shall speak of wisdom, and the meditation of my heart shall be of understanding. This is what he wants the rich and the poor alike to hear. They that trust in their wealth and boast themselves in the multitude of their riches, these, like sheep, they are laid in the grave. Death shall feed on them, and the upright shall have dominion over them in the morning, and their beauty shall consume in the grave. from their dwelling. The rich and the poor, the high and the low, will all be equal eventually. We will all be made equal. But then the psalmist also says, "But God will redeem my soul from the power of the grave, for he shall receive me." Amen. Even in our equality, or even in our inequality, our equality ultimately in this world points us to the glory that we aspire to share in another world, in another time, beyond this world, after death, after this time. I was struck by these passages in the psalmist in today's psalm readings from the Psalms, and I strongly recommend that if you have some time tonight, tomorrow morning, read the whole psalm. It's a pretty good excerpt in today's Mass, but the whole psalm is actually really extraordinary. It's very powerful. I haven't read the whole psalm in a long time, so I recommend it. It's really about the kind of fundamental equality that we share, in spite of the appearance of inequality of the world that we live in. And this was the theme in many ways that I want to speak about tonight. Let's see if this works. Does this work? Of course not. Here, let's see if this works. Yes. I thought I'd begin with a picture of my office. This is where I write. Jacob out there is familiar with my home. He used to live right next door to me when he was a student in South Bend, Indiana, at the little university there. This is where I wrote my best-selling book. And in fact, if I could do a close-up of this, the outline of the book is what's taped to the wall. This was as I began writing about it. But what I wanted to show you tonight was the painting that's above my desk. The painting that's above my desk is in some ways intended as a kind of reminder to me about the teachings of Psalm 49. It's a painting by Jean-François Millet, a fairly famous painting, one of the more popular paintings from the early period of the French Impressionist movement. The painting is called the Angelus. The Angelus portrays a couple, obviously a couple of not great means, fairly poor. Their clothes are fairly common, a little ragged. And what they clearly do for a living is, it's not even clear they farm. They may just glean. The fields have been stripped clean. They've been harvested. They're out there with their little wheelbarrow and a pitchfork, and they're picking up what's left over, what the farmer may not have picked. And there are paintings of gleaners. These were the people who may not have owned land, and so you would get the leftovers. These, in a sense, were the poorest of the poor, those people for whom this psalm was at least intended as the people who don't have anything, who see their lives as fundamentally unequal to those of great wealth and great majesty. And this painting, it strikes me as extraordinarily beautiful, both because of its beauty, the scene it portrays, but because also what it's portraying, the deeper meaning of what it's portraying, which is they've stopped. These people who probably work all day long just for a subsistence living, they've stopped because my guess is it's evening. There's some things in the wheelbarrow. It may be dawn. My guess is it's evening. It's 6 o'clock. In the distance, you can see the church tower that is presumably ringing its bells, and they've stopped to say the Angelus. It's the title of the painting, the Angelus prayer, the prayer of the Annunciation, the prayer that announces the birth or the impending birth of Christ. They are saying the Angelus probably around 6 p.m. In a way in which their ordinary, modest existence is raising their view toward the majesty, both of the incarnation of Christ, this most common, ordinary child that's born, that announces to all of us the fact that we are all fundamentally extraordinary, endowed with a kind of fundamental transcendent dignity. That in this moment of, in some ways, or in this portrayal of deep inequality, it's also a kind of promise of their glory and of the majesty that they hope someday to attain after this world. The psalmist today, I think, gives us some intimation of this. Jean-François Millet wrote about this painting, which was very popular even during his lifetime, although he didn't make very much money from it. This is what he said about it. He said, "The idea for the Angelus came to me because I remembered that my grandmother, hearing the church bell ringing when we were working in the fields, always made us stop work and say the Angelus prayer for the poor departed, very religiously, with cap in hand." Now, I was recently, this painting, I was reminded, not just that it's in my office, but I was reminded of, in many ways, how fitting it is in some of the writing and work I've been doing lately, not only as an inspiration on the wall above my desk, but in a book that I had an opportunity to revisit recently, a powerful book and a short book, and one that I recommend to you, by the Jesuit priest Jean Danielou, which is called Prayer as a Political Problem, a book that he published in 1967. And it was recently reissued by Cluny Press, Cluny Publishers, which is a wonderful press that's publishing and republishing a lot of really great classics in the Catholic tradition, many of which have gone out of print, this being one of those books. And it's just a lovely, wonderful book. But I don't think they could have picked a more fitting illustration as the cover of this book than at least just a portion of the painting. Here, the woman praying with the church tower in the background. Danielou, in this book, sought to explore a question that I think many of us would not even consider to be a question. The question is, how do you order a society that supports, encourages, fosters a life of prayer among ordinary people, among the most ordinary people, among the most common people? We tend to think this isn't a problem per se. Anyone can pray anytime they want. You have a right to pray so far. We'll see how things go. But generally, they're not stopping you from praying. So we're all equal in our ability to pray. Danielou saw that prayer, and for some of those reasons that I've already mentioned, prayer is a central practice to the flourishing of human life. It keeps our minds fixed on the things that really matter, not the earthly wealth, which will pass away and death will be eating us all in the grave, or what we think of as perhaps ourselves, but the things that really matter lie beyond the grave. And prayer is that opportunity and that practice that reminds us of that which really matters. And what Danielou argues in this book is that prayer, while being a central practice for a flourishing human life, is deeply challenged and challenging in the contemporary world. And these challenges arise especially as a consequence of aspects of the modern world that makes it particularly difficult for those who are least well off to engage in a life of prayer. He sees the challenges arising from the modern condition. Again, this book is written in 1967, so the things he's describing in 67 only seem to have accelerated in our time. First is time itself, a world of constant activity, of constant motion and distraction, the lack of time that we all experience. The second thing he mentions, again, 1967, is the problem of, or challenge of technology. That which is supposed to free us, but which in fact, in practice, deprives us of certain kinds of freedom, deprives us of a certain kind of opportunity, right, to stop, to pause, to stop one's work. Right? Imagine trying to do this in a, if you're working in an Amazon warehouse, where if you want to urinate, you have to have a bottle next to you. Right? There's no time, technology. And the third of these is the challenge of worldliness. Right? And this is, again, 1967 is compared to today. The consumerism, the abandonment and encouragement of abandonment of a horizon beyond our own time, our own place, and our own immediate satisfaction. Danielou sees these as challenges that everyone will face, no matter their station. But he sees it as especially falling in a particularly hard way, a difficult way, upon the most ordinary people of society. In a society in which he thinks that not only will wealth become concentrated in one group of people, but the benefits of wealth, a certain amount of leisure, a certain amount of freedom from the drudgery of life, a certain amount of liberation from the distractions that otherwise face us. And I think the elite are not especially insulated from these. But Danielou thinks that if there is anyone that's going to be insulated, it's going to be those who are more fortunate. And he concludes that what we face in the modern world is a threat to what he calls that what was once a democracy of prayer. Democracy of prayer. He calls it a democracy. Like the word that's on everybody's lips these days, right? Our democracy is under threat. Danielou would say our democracy in a sense is under threat because the opportunity, the genuine opportunity, supported by the social order to pray is being constantly undermined. Now here's a quote that seems appropriate. We're in a seminary. Danielou writes the following: I might mention that monks create for themselves, not that you guys are monks, but I might mention that monks create for themselves the environment in which they can pray effectively. In this last consideration that brings us, it is this last consideration that brings us to the heart of our problem. If monks, right, who have a lot of time, not necessarily a lot of distraction, but if monks feel the need to create an environment in which they will find prayer possible, if they think prayer is not possible without certain kinds of conditions of silence, solitude, and rule, what are we to say of the mass of mankind? Should prayer be the privilege of a small spiritual aristocracy? And should the bulk of the Christian people be excluded from it? What a powerful passage. A small spiritual aristocracy who will get to do this, who will have the opportunity to pray. He goes on and he writes, we must react against any view that makes spiritual life the privilege of a small number of individuals. For such a view betrays the essential point of a message which is not only Christian, but religious, that a life of prayer is an absolutely human vocation. Thus, for Danielou, the problem of prayer is not simply an individual problem. It's not a problem that you are called upon to solve individually. It's a political problem. It's a problem of the polis. It's a problem that we share. The monks have a way of dealing with it within the monastery. Do we? Especially in a world that makes it so difficult to carve out the time. This painting portrays a church tower that's ringing twice a day at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. to remind us and to call us to prayer. Do we live in such a world where we are given the opportunity and indeed expected, anticipated to stop and to pray? He goes on then to say the following, and I quote, politics ought to have care of the common good. That is to say, the duty of creating an order in which personal fulfillment is possible, where man might be able to completely fulfill his destiny. And as part of the common good, he suggests we should be concerned about the problem of prayer as a community, as a political order. Now here he invokes the language of common good, a word these days much in debate. What is the common good? Is there a common good? What is it? I'm sure within these walls, lots of discussions about what the common good is according to the Catholic tradition, lots of thinking through natural law and Thomas Aquinas. I think, though, Danielou gives us at least one way of thinking about the common good that may be a way that we typically don't think about it, which is to think about it less, or to focus less on the word good and more on the connotations of the word common. This word common, right, coming from, etymologically, coming through modern France to the word commune, from the Latin communis, meaning that which belongs to all, owned or used jointly, general, of a public nature or character. In the French commune, common, general, free, open, public, something available to all. From the most ancient compound, meaning that which is held in common, together, shared by all. This this meaning or origin of these words also has another meaning with which we are quite familiar. Not only that which is shared, but that which is ordinary, that which is basic, that which is everyday. Right? It's a common thing. It's a commonplace, that which is not extraordinary. This idea of common as being familiar, shared by all or many, or not pretentious, as the definition goes. It's this understanding of commonness that was very often, extraordinarily often, a concern, also a political concern, we can say, a concern of politics, a concern of political philosophy. This role of commonness, or the place of commonness, was especially a source of concern of classical political philosophers. Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Thomas Aquinas. And if we think about it, again, if we think etymologically or the way that we use these words, think about the following. And I'm actually trying to think about this for my book right now. Finding a word for that which is uncommon with a positive connotation is actually pretty easy. And we have lots of words for it. Those things we associate with the upper class. It's really easy to find very positive, sort of inherently praiseworthy words. The word aristocracy, which we might not think is so positive anymore, nevertheless, in Greek has a very positive connotation, kind of people of excellence. The word aristoi means at its root excellence, people of distinction and good quality. Or consider maybe one of the greatest words in the English language, patrician, which lies behind a certain name of someone who's here tonight. It comes from the word pater, father, right? And who could debate with a very positive connotation of the word father? Not in this house. Consider the word dignity, the root of the word dignitary, right? Somebody who is a person of dignitary, a person of worth or distinction or esteem. Or think of the word nobility, that which is noble, a person of nobility. Describe the high-born, people of excellence, something noble. All these words, excellence, grace, dignity, greatness. Now try to find a positive word for everyday people, or the everyday. Common. Is that a great thing? Now when we say common good, it sounds good. But that which is common is ordinary. And think of lots of other words. Base, ordinary, not distinguished, commoners, plebeians. The ancient Greek word for many was oklos, which means mob, the mob. Ochlocracy is a word you see used in the English language until relatively recent times. Peasant, multitude, crowd, mass. Or that word that scares everyone nowadays, populus, the populists, the people. What could be more base than that? For the ancients, even embedded in our language is a distinction that's drawn between the high and the low, the excellent and the base, drawing a distinction from the high and the excellent from the subpar. And unsurprisingly, ancient constitutionalism ranked democracy, rule of the many, it ranked it very low. This is, of course, always disturbing to my contemporary students. Plato ranks it as the second worst regime. Aristotle is the best of the worst regimes. Democracy is a deficient regime. It's always going to be sort of peopled by the ordinary, the mob. And it was typically the argument of these authors that the best form of rule would be that rule by the excellent one or the excellent few, a monarch or an aristocracy. Now that's the kind of crib note version, the spark notes version of the ancient constitutional tradition. But if you keep reading in the ancient constitutional tradition, you'll actually discover that this regime, the regime of the excellent, is really hard to create. It's really hard to bring it into reality because it's very hard to find the one really good person or just the few very good people. As we know, it's just hard to find those folks. And so they quickly move to a discussion of the best practicable regime. What's the best way to organize human society in practice? And in this regard, here I think there's a lesson that I think would be very valuable for us to relearn as a nation today. And the nation is an argument of the idea of the mixed constitution, the ancient idea of the mixed constitution, the mixed regime. It's one that sought, and the argument was to combine the best aspects of the rule of the few, who usually got the top billing, all the good words, and the rule of the many. Because while in theory the rule of the few was the best, in practice the few had their vices, the many had their vices, but they also had their virtues. Each class had its own set of virtues and its own set of vices. The many, of course, were more likely to be elevated and to have elevated tastes. They had the benefits of wealth, of leisure, of education, freedom from menial tasks. The root of our word that describes the kind of ideal form of education, liberal education, we use that word a lot, or that combination of words. I want to study the liberal arts. What's the root and origin of that combination of words? It's people who are free from the drudgery of menial labor, from the farmers gleaning in the fields. To have a liberal education is to be a free person, the education of a free person, freed from menial labor. And I never cease to try to remind my students of this because they think their education is all about getting a job. I said, you've betrayed the very purpose of what a liberal education is. You think you're getting a liberal education, but you're not. Because of these benefits, because of these advantages, the few, the nobles, the elevated were likely to have taste. They were likely to have a form of education that revealed or at least reflected the ability to identify the beautiful, the good, to be fascinated with questions that are the advantage of the leisured, to be free of menial tasks. But what the ancient tradition, of course, also recognized is that they were also prone to congratulate themselves. And again, the psalm tonight is absolutely wonderful on this point. Right? The wealthy, sit around patting themselves on the back. Well, I really made all the right decisions in life. Getting born to my parents was a great, great idea. Right? That old line from Molly Ivins about George H.W. Bush. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, or silver foot in his mouth. I guess that was it. And because of this, they have a tendency or temptation to see themselves as better than others, to condescend, to look down upon those who don't share their position. And that tendency led to an extreme, and I think it is a reflection of our contemporary society, leads them to think that they are the better rulers, the best rulers, and that they rule for their own advantage. A tendency toward this tendency toward self-congratulation leads them to mistake their own advantage as the common good, their own benefit as that benefit of all. By contrast, the virtues of ordinary people make it likely that they will be, to go back to these guys, they will be moderate in their tastes, satisfied with a lot of potato soup, that they will be close to the ground. Now, literally in this case. But I think we can also say more broadly, close to the stuff of the world, familiar with how things are in reality. Right? People we recently were praising as essential workers until they started making up trouble up in Canada. These are those people, essential workers, not the rest of us. These are people who actually really need to do things. These are people who know how to do things. They are aware of limits for this reason. Right? Either the electric current works or it doesn't. The plumbing is running or it doesn't. When you're a college professor, you never know if you've done your work at the end of the day. If you're a plumber, you know if you've done a good job. They are the people that typically are traditional in their dispositions and their habits. They practice customs and carry on folkways. They tend to desire peace because the ordinary people don't do well in war. They want, they are practical-minded, want a degree of stability in their world. And here's one use of the word common I haven't mentioned yet. They are often possessing of common sense. That word, those combination of words that we use without thinking what they mean. The sense of ordinary people, right? Just good sense, common sense. Use your common sense. But there are also people with certain vices, and they tend to be the opposite ones of the upper classes. A certain crudeness, lack of refinement, lack of education, not appreciating the things that leisured people can appreciate. Probably not being able to create those things. Maybe not able to support those things. And having a tendency and perhaps a temptation toward resentment. And this is one of the things the psalmist is also trying to teach in tonight's readings. It's not just that the high shouldn't overestimate their status. The low shouldn't necessarily be resentful of those people that are high because we'll all be equal. Tendency toward resentment, and that resentment can become politically active as a form of mob mentality and an attraction to demagogues. That most ancient fear, the demagogue who stokes the resentment of the masses. The idea of the mixed constitution wasn't just let's have some mixing, let's have checks and balances. It wasn't just let's have a couple branches of government. It was, how do you prevent the worst of these vices of each of these classes, which will exist in every society? How do you prevent the worst vices from manifesting themselves, while also encouraging the virtues of those respective classes of people? And it turns out that they can correct each other. A really good mixed constitution is one in which the vices of the one are corrected by the virtues of the other. And so you want to have a constitution that blends these two elements together in various ways. If a decent balance was achieved, one could achieve a fairly good society. One could achieve a fairly good and stable society. But if a bad balance was achieved, then society would become corrupt. One side would take possession to the advantage and ultimately advantage of one class and the destruction of the whole society. The great fear of the ancient thinkers was that instability, a kind of the inability to achieve a kind of balance that could exist over a long period of time. That the great fear was instability would upset that balance. If you could get that balance for a long period of time, this was a good thing. And you see this argument made by Aristotle, whose idea of a mixed constitution is a blending of oligarchy and democracy, kind of mixing the two together. You see this argument in Polybius, a Roman thinker, who argues that the brilliance of Rome was to mix the various classes of society, to create over a long period of time, the period of the Roman Republic, a kind of high degree of stability between the various classes. I would argue, and I got to be careful here, but I would argue this is in Aristotle as well. If you read Aristotle, which I know you do, but Aristotle on question 97, can custom obtain the force of law? It's a really wonderful passage, as many passages by I'm sorry, did I say Aristotle? Aquinas, but many, I mixed them up for a good reason, as are many passages by Aquinas. Aquinas argues in this, in question 97, that custom, generally speaking, law, we would define law as a sort of officially promulgated mandate, something that's written down, and we understand it, and we look at it, and we can refer to it, and lawyers can debate about it, right? Right, Ken? But that, in many cases, what's better than having officially promulgated law is to have really good custom. Having really good custom has all of the force of law, but it has something else that's really important, which is consent. We talk about consent of the governed all the time as if modern social contract theory invented the idea of consent. It's right there in Aquinas. And the form that consent takes is in the form of custom. Custom as something, as he describes it, let me see if I can find a couple of quotes, repeated actions that reveal the internal motives and will of the concepts of reason, that enjoy the consent of the whole community, which is demonstrated by its customary observation. The whole people, then, have in some sense consented to this unwritten law. And he says in these cases where you have good custom, it has to be custom that conforms to the natural law, but where you have good custom, it should be the role, obligation, and duty of the elites to respect and give deference to that custom as if it were law that they themselves were charged with upholding. Now, where would we be as a country if we had elites like that, who weren't always attacking the customs of the many as backward? What was the language that was once used? Clinging to their guns and Bibles. Maybe not guns, but certainly Bibles. I guess guns. Aquinas here is describing a kind of mixed constitution in which virtuous elites, aristoi, might govern well in conformity to a kind of long-standing set of practices and beliefs. How are we doing here? Well, how long? Tell me how long.
15, 20 minutes.
Okay. I don't want to. So I want to offer a kind of a theory, if you will, because I'm a political theorist, for why we are in the condition we're in right now. Why we're in the condition in which we have this internecine war between the classes. That really describes our condition right now. And guess what, folks? Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Polybius, Aquinas, all of these thinkers said, guess what? Every society is riven by this class divide. And you better figure out a way to deal with it, and the way to deal with it is the idea of mixed constitution. And we've forgotten this lesson. And the reason I want to suggest we've forgotten this lesson is because we are under, in some ways, we've been influenced by ideologies that have at their core a belief that instability, rapid change, the putting aside of stability within a society is the greatest good to be sought. That instability in the form of what we typically call progress, change, transformation, whether it's on the left or the right today, is the basis of most of the ideologies of the modern world. That modern philosophy, modern political philosophy, was based implicitly or often explicitly on a rejection of the idea of the mixed constitution, that ancient form of organizing our societies. And we are now, let us say, not enjoying the fruits of these particular set of arrangements. What we see today as these conditions of our politics that just suddenly arose, and we can read about them in the New York Times, is due to a deep dysfunction at the level of our operating system. It's not because whatever explanation happens to be in vogue today. What I want to suggest then, if we were to, and this is a political science, it's a sin of political science and a frequent problem. If we're in love with the four-quadrant box. It's how we organize the world as the four-quadrant box. But it's often helpful. And in thinking about this, precisely this issue, I decided to try to create my own four-part box to help clarify my own thoughts on this, and thought it might be helpful to share it with you. So along the vertical, I'm always challenged about which is vertical. Along the vertical axis, we have differing theories in modernity, whether elites should rule or whether the people should rule. So already we've departed from the idea that what we should aspire to is a mixed constitution. And the reason for this is that there is a great debate undergirding modern times. Which one of these groups, which one of these classes is the class of progress? Which class advances progress in the world? This division is further divided on the question of whether these rulers view the people as a revolutionary force, typically an unstable or a destabilizing force, and that could be good or bad, people as revolutionary, or whether the people are viewed as conservative, as stuck in the mud, as likely to be traditionalist in their worldview. If we begin then to fill in the boxes of this grid, what we begin to see is, in the first instance, classical liberalism, the liberalism of John Locke, the liberalism of our founding fathers, is really categorized in this first box. A belief that we have to arrange a constitution, not in the classical way of the mixed constitution, but one in which a kind of advantage will be given to elites. And if you read carefully our Federalist Papers, you see that arguments by Madison and Hamilton are designed to seek to avoid the mob tendencies of the people. And in order to do this, you create a constitutional system that gives advantages especially to people who are likely to be elites in their societies. Madison's quite clear on this. He says in Federalist 55, one of my favorite passages, he says, we want to have a small House of Representatives. Right? Back then it was about 35 people. We want to have a small House of Representatives because if you get a lot of people together, and imagine the size of a country, the United States today, if you get a lot of people together, they lose their good sense. Right? He says the following. He says, had every Athenian been a Socrates, the Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. Had every Athenian been a Socrates, the Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. You could be as rational as Socrates, as philosophic as Socrates. You put a lot of them together, and it becomes a mob. They lose their reason. You want to have a small number of people making the decisions, running the country. And you design the Constitution to select them. You know, not in a really obvious way, but it's designed in many ways to select them. And the reason is that the many are likely to be destabilizing, especially when it comes to the protection of property, the stability of an economic system, and the protection of an economic system with the right of property at its core. So elites are seen as the party of progress, especially economic progress, against the destabilizing tendency of the population. Now, the response to that is what we today call liberalism, or what we might call progressive liberalism. So classical liberalism is what we sometimes call conservatism. But really, for my purposes tonight, I'm going to call it by its real name, which is progressive liberalism. I'm sorry, classical liberalism. Progressive liberalism, whom we might identify with figures like John Stuart Mill, who we sometimes think of as a classical liberal, but he's rather different than that. But progressive thinkers like John Dewey in the American tradition, and contemporary progressives. I think we'll recognize them here. They see the elites as the party of progress, who have to insulate progress from the people who tend to be conservative. The people, the general mass of humanity, the problem isn't necessarily that they're revolutionary, it's that they're stick in the muds. They won't go along with progress. John Stuart Mill, in his book called On Liberty, speaks of the despotism of custom, that tradition and custom act as despots, more despotic in a way, or more insidiously despotic, than even government forms of despotism, because it permeates life. Like, you can identify a despot when he's oppressing you and he's got his foot on your neck. But when the despotism is in just our way of life, it's difficult to identify. It's just the water that we swim in. And what Mill called for was the liberation of people to be able to act in whatever way they wished, what he called experiments in living. Should be the thing that's defended in a society of freedom. One way that he proposed to make sure that the elites were insulated from the conservative tendency of the many was to argue, he was worried especially about the rise of democracy, and so he argued that one way to protect the course of progress was to make sure that the most educated people in society got more votes than the less educated people in society. So he called for a plural voting program that would be based on basically the attainment of your education. I always like to lord that over my students. I get tons of votes and you get no votes. Right. But that the best way to preserve progress was to make sure that in some way the elites were running the show against the conservative nature of the people. Now this form of argumentation led to its own reaction, which is the argument that the people are revolutionary, they are the party of progress. Right? We want the people to rule. They're the party of progress. And this is the argument that Karl Marx makes. It's the elites that are the conservatives. The people are the revolutionary force. They should rule. They're the ones who should be in the driver's seat. Marx makes this argument, of course, and contemporary Marxists in some ways make this argument. The problem for Marx and Marxists was always the following. It was always empirically problematic. The people just weren't as revolutionary as they said, as Marx thought they were. They would occasionally, rise up and react against injustice, against inequality. But most of the time, they just wanted to live their lives and be left alone. And so Marx and Marxists had to develop various theories for why this was so. One of them was the theory of false consciousness. Right? Well, they don't know their own interests. They've been snookered by the elites. One of them was that they would be led by a vanguard. This is Lenin's argument, right? A group of elites would act in the name of the people. They would really be the people. And then there was Marx in one of his letters. This is in a private moment. In one of his letters, he writes the following. He says, well, the English, they have all the material conditions necessary for revolution. What they lack is the spirit of revolutionary order. So we will rely on the General Council, he says, the Communist Council, to correct this deficiency. And his belief is that we can engage in revolution, and afterwards, he says, we can initiate measures which later, in the public execution of their tasks, appear as if they are spontaneous movements of the English working class. So we can, later on, we can say, this was all the people's doing. So the theory of Marxism was always, that the people themselves were the revolutionary class of society, but the people always didn't often cooperate with this theory. This is the project of the book I'm working on now, the follow-up of my last book, Why Liberalism Failed, which is, unfortunately, my friend Adrian Vermeule stole the title Common Good Constitutionalism, and I think it's a better title than Mixed Constitutionalism, but I'll use it for tonight's purposes. And I see in a tradition that's often associated with the conservative tradition, but a conservatism that's very different than what we associate with, that really articulates a kind of modern version of the idea of mixed constitution. And at its base, the idea of mixed constitution is that the people as a conservative, the masses as a kind of conservative entity of society, should in many ways provide the tenor of society, provide the base of society. Its tendency to want to preserve its way of life should be the guiding force of society. And the elites of society should conform themselves to that. They deserve the title of nobility, of aristocracy, of aristoi, to the extent they conform themselves to a good common sense, to a good set of shared customs. Now, in our world today, what we see increasingly is a combination of all three of the parties of progress here, the top and left bloc, arrayed against the bottom right bloc. And that explains part of our politics today. It really is a combination of what we sometimes call conservatives. This would be your Bill Kristol up on the left, your AOC on the upper right, although she's on the left, and contemporary Marxists on the bottom, all of whom see that their common enemy is the bottom right category. And they are the enemy because it is the box, it is the category that stands for something profoundly different. A society of stability, a society of continuity. And at its base, the kind of society that Danielou was speaking of in his book, Prayer as a Political Problem. What would it mean today to begin to cultivate the necessary conditions for a mixed constitution that rejects as the core aims of society a constant revolutionary transformation, either in the economic sphere or in the social sphere? Well, it would require something that we don't really have today, which is a baseline of good custom, of good practices, which an elite could protect. Those have been significantly undermined. And if you want some evidence of this, I recommend reading in juxtaposition arguments made by the late great Christopher Lasch in 1995 in a book that he wrote called the Revolt of the Elites, in which he talks about the common mass of ordinary people as a kind of stable and virtuous part of American society. And as the elites, as this sort of dangerous revolutionary sort of part of society that has no longer really allegiance to the nation and to the people who are, in a sense, left behind in the nation. And compare that to the arguments made several decades later in Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, in which he describes the same class of people that Christopher Lasch described as sort of manifestations of virtue and stability. And what you read in Charles Murray's book is how they've been sort of battered by the devastation of both sort of the free markets, not that Murray makes this argument, but I'll make this argument, a globalized economic system. I'm here in Ohio, so probably don't have to say too much about that. A battered a system of economics that especially batters the lower middle working classes, but also a set of social issues and social arrangements that undermines those stabilizing force of family, community, neighborhood, church, associations. Both of these, what we think of as today as left and right politics, have combined to undermine the conditions for the practice and development of virtue among a class of people who can't rely on their own devices. Prayer as a political problem is also stability as a political problem. Social stability and the opportunity to develop the kinds of virtues that allow people to flourish regardless of their economic situation and circumstance. So we need to think not only today about an elite class that protects good practices, but what would it take to have an elite class that helps to form them, fosters them anew? What would it look like? It would be in some ways a kind of a politics we're not used to in this country, because we enjoyed for a long time a politics in which prayer was less of a political problem than it is today. But prayer today, among many other things, is a political problem. And for that, I think we're going to have to think anew about what the political solution might look like. Thank you.
Q&A?
Yeah.
Sound good? Okay, thank you, Dr. Deneen. So we do have an opportunity for a few questions this evening, and there are two seminarians with portable microphones. So if you simply signal to them that you'd like to ask a question, and we'll begin right here in the front. Evan, if you could come around to the second row.
Which political theorist would you say has dealt best with the reality of original sin? Probably without ever using that term.
This sounds like my comprehensive exams.
Yeah, well, I didn't steal it.
I'm not sure exactly if that relates to the talk I just gave, so you'll forgive me. Yeah.
At least the three groups
Yeah.
that you mentioned in alliance against the fourth one, the three, I think you could make an argument, are not dealing well with original sin.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the obvious answer, and I'm not sure he counts as a political theorist, but I teach him as a political theorist, would be Augustine. If we're really going to get serious, it would be Augustine. And of course, broadly, the Augustinian tradition, of which there are many thinkers we could point to in the Augustinian tradition. And in an interesting way, there are figures, sorry to go back to there are figures in the upper left box, right, of classical liberalism that write on original sin, that are deeply influenced by the theory of original sin. And of course, James Madison was one of them. James Madison is he's a graduate of Princeton University. Princeton University is a Presbyterian, a.k.a. a Calvinist school. I taught, my first job was at Princeton, and to be an Irishman teaching at a school whose official color is orange was like teaching an oppressive word. I seriously thought about filing harassment charges about this oppressive work environment I had to work in. But it was part of its deep tradition, then at least, and you had as a president Jonathan Edwards, another figure who spoke a lot about original sin. But James Madison was deeply influenced by the idea of original sin. And for this reason, he believed that you had to design a constitution that, in a sense, always assumed the worst of people. It always assumed the worst of people, especially people who weren't as enlightened as people who might be, that he hoped would be the people who would be ruling the country. But even then, he said, you can't count on an enlightened statesman. Plato is not going to govern our society. There might be a little bit too much assumption of original sin without the possibility of grace or even sainthood inscribed in our constitutional tradition. And it's why I think as a people we tend to be very fearful about genuinely talking about ideas like common good and what would be required of the common good. Ruling on behalf of something rather than just preventing a common bad. That's a real difficulty we face. In fact, I mean, this allows me to segue into one thought I've been thinking a lot about lately, which is in the context of the pandemic, and I don't mean to trigger people here, But in the context of the pandemic, the people that have been invoking the language of common good have been the people who have been telling us we must wear masks, 18 masks, 45 masks. I know I'm speaking to a certain crowd because there's not a mask in the crowd, thank God. But we have to wear 40,000 masks and never be within 50 feet of each other and never meet in person again and be online all the time. And these people use the language of common good. And the people who oppose that speak in the language of individual liberty. But in fact, I think we have this all wrong. I think the people who are scared to interact with each other, these people are acting in terms of individual fear and individual security, the desire to preserve their lives. Now, I certainly think we should be thinking especially about the vulnerable in our society, and that's part of the common good. But we also need to be thinking about the young people. We need to be thinking about the young people for whom we know now this virus is not terribly dangerous to these young people. And to do to them and to continue to do to them what we've been doing. This is a question and an issue for the common good, in which people like me should be in the classroom. And I thank God I'm teaching at Notre Dame. We don't do a lot of things right. We do a few things right. But this is one thing we've really done right, is to meet back in person. And I give great credit to President John Jenkins, who I don't always agree with, but for getting us back in person and meeting in class. So I do think that there's a tendency, let's say, original sin, we have to be able to speak about original sin, but we also have to speak about other things too. So thanks, you allowed me to go off on a tangent, but your question invited it. Father.
I was just going to ask you what Disraeli thought about masks. No, just kidding.
Actually, a
I
little known discourse, yeah.
But I would like you to just, if you would, touch on Disraeli's contribution to this common good constitutionalism.
Yeah.
I think you're referencing the British Prime Minister during the Victorian.
Exactly.
So
yeah, Benjamin Disraeli.
I'd
yeah.
be very interested.
Sure. Well,
yeah.
in this book that I'm hopefully finishing very soon, which probably won't be out for another year, I actually have a section on Disraeli, who I think is being rediscovered to an extent, but deserves to be more known than he probably is. He's among the first political figures to call himself a conservative. Edmund Burke never uses the term conservative to describe himself, but in a very specific way. He was a prime minister in the 19th century, middle to late part of the 19th century in England, and so he was the prime minister during the Industrial Revolution. And of course, the Industrial Revolution is a time of great upheaval. Right? We're living through a kind of, we often call it, right, what is this, the third economic revolution, post-industrial revolution we're living through today. And so we're experiencing similar kinds of upheaval as a society. And Disraeli believed that the party of the conservatives, which was the Tory party, and had been historically aligned with the old aristocracy, literally the landed aristocracy. If you like, what's that show my wife loves? Downton Abbey. If you like Downton Abbey, this is the aristocratic class that they liked, that the Tories represented, and the Labour Party represented the people. And what Disraeli saw happening was that the Labour Party was really moving its allegiance to a kind of different constituency. And note this movement, folks. The constituency it was moving toward was the industrial class, the bourgeoisie, the new ownership class, the economically progressive class. Labor was actually ceasing to represent the working class and was moving toward an attraction to the kind of the beginnings of a kind of ownership class. It really resembles, extraordinarily, uncannily, it resembles the trajectory of today's Democratic Party. And I speak as someone who used to be a proud card-carrying member of the Democratic Party, because it was the party of the working class, and it no longer, I think, arguably it no longer is. And Disraeli says that the Tories have to move from representing the aristocracy to representing through a kind of cultivation of a new elite, representing the interests of the people, of ordinary people. This will be what conservatism is. And he hoped to bring the old aristocracy to that, but to align what had formerly been divided, to begin to align a kind of older aristocratic tradition with the desire for stability and continuity that was expressed especially among the working class. So Disraeli really foresaw what's been happening in British politics over the last few years. And this is one of the reasons for the interest in Disraeli these days, which if you pay attention to British politics, in the last election, districts in England that had voted for over 200 years only for the Labour Party voted for the Tory Party. And that's what put Boris Johnson overwhelmingly into office. there was a real realignment of that politics. And I would suggest there's a kind of similar realignment taking place in the United States today. So Disraeli was a figure who really, he wasn't necessarily altogether successful in this, and things kind of went back a little bit to the way they had been after he was prime minister. But he really foresaw that there was going to, if you really wanted to be a conservative party, which the Tory party saw it as, it had to become the party of the people. So he represents, I think, that fourth quadrant that I discussed tonight. Thanks.
One more question here in the back, or here in the front.
We can do two more. We can
We'll
do,
do the one in the back in a moment.
yeah, we do two.
Hello.
Hi.
With regard to, you were talking about Marxism, and you spoke, a little derisively of, Lenin's concept of the vanguard and such. But with regard to promoting the bottom right order, it doesn't seem to me that inherently the populace we now have naturally all, would, vote for all politicians that fit into the bottom right quadrant. Yeah. And it seems to, some theorists in this area, I'm thinking of Adrian Vermeule, who you mentioned, have mentioned sort of needing, a certain form of elites in power to promote those interests. I'm just wondering, how would that sort of differ from like a Marxist concept of the vanguard? I'm not, against such means, but
I really appreciate the question, and maybe it helps clarify what I was moving pretty quick because I took too much time toward the beginning. I think it really is, the idea of the vanguard is that the elite have to correct, right? They have to, they lead the people to where their natural, what the vanguard, what the elites believe the people should believe and how they should act. So in other words, they are acting in some ways to correct where the people are. And I think this is why I want to suggest that this bottom right quadrant really, I think, fundamentally represents, and here I don't think there's a difference between where Adrian is and where I am. I think the emphasis is a little different, which is that the elite in this society, it's not that you're getting rid of the elite, and none of these quadrants suggest you're getting rid of the many and the few. It's just who's going to be in charge. The suggestion is that, and again, appealing back to Danielou, is that society can be sort of deeply informed by and guided by the common and ordinary needs and interests of ordinary people, right? Which tend, again, to be sometimes a little simple and need to be elevated. I'm not saying like the people are the paragons of virtue and excellence, the many. And here I do think that there's a definitive role for elites, not in contradicting them and in guiding them to the way they should think, but in cultivating certain excellences that I think elites are especially capable of doing. Universities, and here's one of the ways in which I think liberal education, we've lost what liberal education really is. Liberal education was, in fact, as it's today called, it's privileged. Right? And we say that today as a bad thing. Right? You have privilege. These institutions that generations that preceded us built, sometimes in the case of Notre Dame, literally by making the bricks. Right? Your predecessors, students at the University of Notre Dame, that's how they paid for tuition. They dug up the mud from Lake St. Mary and Lake St. Joseph, and they shaped and fired the bricks that the oldest buildings are made out of. These people who literally made the bricks, it wasn't so that they could create institutions that would someday apologize for being privileged. It was precisely that you wanted to have a part of society that had privilege, that had the privilege of attending a place like that, because you had a duty, a responsibility to elevate the entire tenor of the society, not to contradict it, but to elevate it. And of course, this was done popularly through priests and ministers. This was the way you would access the many, was through church going. This is why most of these institutions always had seminaries or formation of ministers attached to them. Princeton's theological seminary. Right? All these institutions they were forming ministers, because this is one of the ways that privileged people would enter into the mainstream of everyday life and elevate. Not contradict, but elevate. Right? Prayer as a real possibility and something that was encouraged. Now today to have a group of people who run around saying we're all equals here at Harvard, there's no privileged people here, we are living in sort of cloud cuckoo land, in a complete absurdity. This is a denial of what you actually are for the sake of pretending that you're not elites, and therefore having no responsibility to anyone outside of your circle. So I think places like Notre Dame should be embracing the fact that they are elite institutions and taking responsibility as elite institutions, because it's precisely as elite institutions that you don't contradict society, which is what Harvard is now doing, but you elevate it. And this is where I think you see the idea of the mixed constitution in this last quadrant. And so Adrian Vermeule tends to emphasize on the role of elites in this, and I tend to concentrate on the way in which elites need to be informed and even corrected by ordinary people. Yeah, thanks. Last question.
Hi. My question is a little bit targeted, but I'm a former...
I'm glad you're back there. Likely to miss.
So I'm a former businessman, and one of the things that I see perhaps incorrectly about this is the phrase of corporate social responsibility in businesses, and that feels to me to be sort of this mixed constitution, right? But my question is, how do you weigh whether or not that's being an effective tool? Because for every Starbucks that you can see a Chick-fil-A, right? And these have a polarizing impact rather than a unitive or a common impact. So do you find that to be problematic? Do you see that as a positive step? Your thoughts?
So I think a lot of what we think about as corporate social responsibility is it's a version of what Harvard is doing, which is nowadays with environmentalism they call it greenwashing. This is what I call privilege washing, or equality washing. It's how you demonstrate how socially conscious you are without actually having to really be socially conscious. I'm really interested in some developments that are taking place that really might disturb you and maybe some others in the audience, but I'm actually really quite excited about them. I believe it's Senator Rubio has proposed instituting as part of the recognition of corporations as persons, which is it's a legal fiction, and it's subject to alteration, that of corporations of certain size or wealth, that there needs to be worker representation on a board. That doesn't mean you're running the board, but that workers should have a voice on the board. Why not? Don't they have a vested interest in that company? Aren't their communities and their lives bound up in the future of that company? Why shouldn't they have a voice in those institutions? This is a common practice around the world. It's a common practice in Germany. My wife is from Germany, and Germany's got its problems, but it's got certain humane things about it. That treatment of workers is actually really good. Maybe too good, but in the view of some, but it's a lot better than it is in the United States. I think thinking through these kinds of ways that we could create a genuinely mixed constitution, which isn't just about how we shape the Constitution. I should stress this. I'm not talking about the Constitution. I'm talking about Constitution as a way of life, as how we organize our society. How do we create mixing? And I've been thinking a lot about this. How do you create opportunities to mix these classes so that they can begin correcting each other, their own worst vices? I think another way of doing this would be not touching in the corporate world, but thinking about ways, for example, of how elite universities can be reaching out more and participating more in the ordinary world and ordinary lives. And I don't have necessarily a lot of policy ideas about this. I do have one crazy idea, which is that we forgive the student loans, like especially the wealthy institutions, forgive the student loans of any student who enters a seminary, or who becomes a firefighter, or becomes a soldier, or becomes a school teacher. I hear from so many students at Notre Dame, I would love to do X, what Jacob is doing, if I didn't have to pay back my loans and I have to go work, on Wall Street. What if we said, Notre Dame just could do this all by itself. We have enough money. What if we just said, hey, if you want to take your degree and go work on Wall Street, good for you. Just pay back your loans. But if you want to become a priest, gone, wiped out. No more debt. We got your back. Now, we create a lot of issues and problems. Who's going to get it? Who's not? What job counts? It's fine. Let's deal with that. But why shouldn't an institution like Notre Dame be encouraging our students to kind of pursue the forms of work that our students typically don't do, in part because they owe so much money, but because it's just not within the realm of what our students think about, but would actually constitute a contribution to a good life and a better society? Because we'd have people educated at our institutions that are mixing with an entirely different group of people than they're mixing with right now. So I think we need to think creatively about what a mixed constitution would look like in this time and place. And one way might be some idea of worker representation, but there's lots of other ways we could think about that. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening, and especially thanks to Dr. Deneen. Have a great night.